Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State at that time, she was here in town and she made an announcement about President Obama's policy shift. He called it the pivot to Asia and Pacific, right? And they made a big deal at the East-West Center. He came out and said some other things, and it's been this ongoing process of shifting resources from Europe and the Middle East to the Asia Pacific because they see that this region is the strategic region for the future, especially with the growth of the economic and military power of China. The United States is very concerned, so they're trying to sort of hedge that by containing those developments. But I guess one of the main points I want to make in this talk is just that pivot didn't happen just in 2011. It's a much older pivot that Hawaii played a pivotal role in, to use up on, right? It was a fulcrum of an earlier pivot when the United States shifted from a continental empire to an overseas empire. And so I start with this quote from David Malo, Hawaiian historian. And he said, when the high tide rises, these large fish will come out of the dark ocean and we'll see the small fish and eat them up, right? So what is he talking about here? He's using poetic language, but what is he referring to?
U.S. imperialism.
Right? I mean, well, not just U.S., but just imperialism, right? That there are imperial countries. Look at the date, 1837. So the countries of Europe are going around the world and are starting to carve up the planet and take over places and resources, right? So he's saying this as a kind of a prophecy, but it's couched in poetic language, but it's meant as a warning to the Hawaiian chiefs, the rulers, that they need to watch out for these developments. This is something that's going to be happening. So a few years later, what are these large fish? This is Indiana Senator Beveridge. She's sort of an arch expansionist, right? The Pacific is our ocean. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world. And that power is and will forever be the American Republic. So, he just sort of lays it out really starkly, really plainly, what were the kind of political ambitions of this time, right? And Hawaii stands right in the middle of this, of their vision. And so here's Secretary of State Clinton in 2011. The United States stands at a pivot point to pursue a more geographically distributed, right, operationally resilient, and politically sustainable force posture. So this refers to the kind of shifting of military assets all around the world, but mainly concentrating them in the region. And some of the places that are going to be affected most, and that where there's the most sort of political friction being generated, places like Korea, Okinawa, Guam, Philippines, and also here in Hawaii, right? Because this means an expansion of military presence and all the impacts that come with that. So, just to play with this metaphor of a pivot, every pivot, if you remember your physics classes, right? Every pivot needs a fulcrum. It needs a point that it balances on, and that enables. If you have a long enough lever and a good pivot, you could lift something very heavy with little force on this end, right? It allows you to transfer that force and multiply it in a way to move it. So Archimedes, the Greek philosopher, said, "Give me a place to stand and I will move the earth." So with the right position, you can move a great things with the right leverage, right? With the right kind of fulcrum. So how did, for the U.S., Hawaii became one of those places to stand, to move the earth, right? So how did that happen? How did Hawaii become that sort of a place in the world? Oops. So, I'm going to just kind of go through quickly some of these developments in the evolution of U.S. imperial processes, right? So you have the idea of manifest destiny, this idea that merges sort of the material, physical expansion with this idea of religious providence, right? And I think this is what this painting is called. Sort of like the light coming from the east. This progress is moving across with wagon trains, and you got trains, you got settlers, and here in the darkness being pushed out are the Native Americans, right? So it's clearing the land. This is a classic sort of idea of an example of the settler colonial process, which is somewhat different from the British territorial colonialism. Okay, if you think of like Britain colonizing India, it wasn't to drive the people out, but it was sort of to maintain a dominance over their system, utilizing their resources and their labor to get wealth back to Britain, right? In the settler colonial model, which Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand are kind of the prime examples of, it's about a kind of a taking of the land. So you have to remove the people who are already there and sort of erase them from the landscape. And so in order to justify that, you have to also create an other of those other people, right? They have to be different to such an extent that their rights and claims don't count, don't have weight in your legal or moral system, right? So that othering process is a classic kind of thing that happens where people are pushed out because they're not as developed, they're childlike, they're not civilized, whatever the kind of justification is, it helps to justify these other material interests that they have, right? And here's President Roosevelt. I guess before he was president, he was a frontiersman. But he talks about how the most ultimately righteous of all wars is the war with savages. So again, just the idea that the denigration of the other is a kind of a necessary psychic conditioning in order to justify the acts that follow, right? You can't do it to another human being that you believe is sort of on par with you. But if they're lesser than you, it makes it okay. And so this same idea, makes the transit all the way to what happens in most recently in Afghanistan and Iraq and these other places where the U.S. has gone in, and you have people like Robert Kaplan, right? He's writes about foreign policy, saying real plain, this is about back to the days of fighting Indians. So the idea of the savage, of the Indian that needs to be sort of subdued through force makes its way across many wars against many different locations. Indigenous scholar Jody Bird, she writes about how that idea of the Indian is sort of a necessary condition of, where it gets projected onto other places. And so even here you have, the pictures, the horrifying pictures from Abu Ghraib and the kind of torture that went on, but it has this genealogy back to even places like the Philippine-American War, right? Where the water torture, the water cure they call this, was invented, where they would force water down someone's throat until they died, right, basically. And that's what they were doing in some of these places to sort of force a confession out of their captives. Another kind of ideology that supported this process was famous historian Frederick Jackson Turner, right? So he wrote this whole thing called the frontier thesis. Basically, that in American history, he's saying, and he's writing again at the end of the 19th century, that the frontier was a really important part of how American culture and society remained vital, right? It needed new land to colonize. It needed the challenge of that frontier where people reinvented themselves, and that's what kept them sharp, that's what kept the country vital. And that process of renewal was what enabled the U.S. to rise to greatness. But at this point in history, is there any frontier left? Right, they already hit the West Coast, right? So it ended. He's saying, oh man, the West has closed, right? The census is reporting there's no more frontier. So it creates a kind of a cultural crisis, right? Of like, how do you maintain the vitality of the nation when that necessary engine is no longer functioning? The other thing that's going on in the background, so there's kind of like parallel processes. We all studied the Monroe Doctrine, right? President Monroe said, Europe and the European countries, hands off. America is our backyard, right? And so even though the republics in Latin America were independent, the U.S. claimed to have kind of a super sovereignty over them, right? And that they were the big brother and we're going to protect them. And so all these other countries had to stay out. So it was a new model of imperialism that we hadn't really seen before. but it was sort of based on the idea that we're all kind of equal, except I'm a little bit more equal than you. And so if you act out of line, I get to discipline you, right? Gunboat diplomacy, they bring the boats in if a country was not behaving in the way that the US wanted, right? If they weren't going along with the agenda. And so this doctrine gets transferred to Hawaii with President Tyler. In 1842, he declares the Tyler Doctrine, which basically says Monroe Doctrine sort of pivots to include Hawaii. So think about that. If all of America is the US's backyard, and now it extends 3,000 miles into the Pacific, right? That's what they're doing with this. It's just creating this whole new spatial arrangement, right? So that's kind of this is significant. I mean, I think this idea of a Monroe Doctrine, some scholars would argue that the way that US power works in the world today is kind of like a global Monroe Doctrine. That everyone's equal as independent states, right? Except when they decide you're not. And in that case, you get drone strikes, you get invasions, you get whatever to dislodge or regime change, right? So it's a new kind of way of doing foreign policy that we hadn't seen with the older imperialisms. Right? There's also this shift that's happening in terms of military technology and the kind of the way power is enacted in the world. So Alfred Mahan is a kind of a famous naval strategist, right? He wrote about sea power. He also very much wrote about Hawaii. He was very interested in Hawaii in his scheme of sea power. Because he saw the United States as having command of two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and connecting it through a canal through the isthmus in Latin America, right? So all of this is happening at the same time. The idea of a canal, the idea of a base in Hawaii, in the Pacific, and also a base in the Caribbean. And so as soon as the overthrow happens, he writes an editorial about Hawaii in the New York Times, and he lays it out right there, right? We have to take Hawaii, now's a chance, right? This is a necessary thing. And the way that, what's really interesting is how they frame Hawaii as, it's either we take Hawaii and we use Hawaii to our advantage, or someone else gets Hawaii and then it's a mortal threat to the United States. So it's either or, there's no in between. Hawaii doesn't even have a claim in that, right? It's just what powerful countries do to small places. And so here again, Roosevelt, right, if I had my way, we would annex these islands tomorrow. This is him writing to Mahan. They were pen pals. The other thing that's going on is the kind of imperialism that forms after the Spanish-American War. So we have these insular cases, right, that define this kind of territory, a possession that belongs to the United States, but is not quite a part of it, right? Guam, Puerto Rico, Philippines. And so this is defined in law, which is a really strange thing. Guam is still a colony, Puerto Rico is still a colony. The Philippines got independence nominally, right? But in this kind of cartoon, like really lays it out. So you have Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Philippines here being schooled for the United States. You have the other states here being good citizens. These ones need to be disciplined. African Americans doing their service. The Native American, right, being punished, and the Chinese person outside, right, not even admitted in.
But they built the school.
But they built a school.
Right.
To it. So interesting, the racialization that goes along and the kind of differential status that people get in this process of racializing. So I think there's a lot of debates in academia and in public international policy sort of circles where they say, well, is the United States an empire, yes or no? Arguments on both sides. And a lot of it depends on how they define what an empire is. And so there's all these ways that people try to classify what an empire is. But I prefer, Anne-Laura Stoller is an anthropologist. I like the way she says that the variability of different forms of imperial process are what mark imperial power, right? It's not a type, it's not a class that you can easily fit one size that fits all, right? That you can fit all these into a definition. But they're saying, but those variations, the production of exceptions and the uneven and changing proliferation are part of what defines imperial power, and one of the things that makes the U.S. really, what makes its power really hard to pin down, right? So I like to use this idea of imperial formation. It also highlights the fact that it's a process and not a thing. So just to kind of keep that in mind. And so, like Hawaii, I think we can see that there's different kinds of imperial processes at work. I listed out some of those different modes, but you have this idea that an independent kingdom, right, the Hawaiian kingdom, that gets this Tyler Doctrine sort of extended to it, is overthrown, but with the aid of U.S. troops, right? And so it's again, it's an exercise of this kind of like your sovereignty is contingent on U.S. approval, which is a new kind of way of dealing with states as supposedly equals, right? You have the other thing that's going on is the kind of projection of the native, the savage, onto Hawaii in the way that Hawaiians are depicted in the media, but ongoing, right, to the ways that Hawaiians were unfit to rule, and so that justifies the overthrow and the sort of occupation that follows, right? Unfit to govern. And then you have the kind of oscillation between incorporated and unincorporated territories. So unincorporated territories, Guam, Puerto Rico, right? They're citizens, but they can't vote for president. They pay taxes, but they don't get all the benefits. Incorporated territory, Hawaii was determined to be an incorporated territory along the lines of what was called the Northwest Ordinance. So when the sort of the Midwest of the country was taken, they used this law to say that these places could be incorporated until a future time when it becomes a state, right? It was based on the assumption that these areas, these territories, once they became organized politically, could become a state. So that logic was extended to Hawaii and Alaska, right? Which is different. And the key factor in that was that there were American settlers here. So the settler colonial dynamic is really important in terms of justifying why Hawaii can become more acceptable as a part of the United States, but it's not ready yet, right? It's a deferral is what it is. And so that's happening also between these types of the oscillation between these two modes. And the other thing is the shift from continental to sea power, right? So Mahan's vision really is still in operation a lot today. The idea that by commanding the seas, you command the world economy, and you need nodes of power from which to project power, right? So Hawaii becomes one, Puerto Rico becomes another, and Panama. So the pivot, just to reiterate, the pivot is a continuation of this old idea, right? It's just, and Hawaii, these kinds of geographic points become really key in terms of how to enact that. And so Roosevelt already saw it, right, in 1905. The Pacific will be key, more important than Europe. So some of this also relies on a very specific local geography, right? It's not just the abstract geography of dots on a map, but it needs an actual physical place. So General Schofield and Colonel Alexander came here 1872, 1873 on a mission. There was supposed to be a diplomatic mission, but they were writing secret dispatches back to their military superiors in Washington, and they were supposed to be scouting out potential military sites. So it is the key to the Central Pacific Ocean. It is a gem of these islands, valueless to them because they cannot use it, but more valuable to the United States than all else the islands have to give. General Schofield. What does he talk about? What do you think he's writing about? What place is this key? No. Think about, what's...
Looks more like Waianae or something.
Well, never mind the picture. This is just a picture of him scouting out, but what is the key to the Central Pacific Ocean? Pu'uloa, Pearl Harbor, right? Pearl Harbor. Yeah? And so this is the kind of, I think for most people in the world, because of the war, because of the December 7th attack, I think this is the kind of images that most people have of Pearl Harbor, and this is where it gets sort of burned onto our memory, right? Or things like this where people go and visit, the most visited tourist attraction in Hawaii. But people don't know that this place was such a productive resource for Kanaka Maoli for thousands, hundreds, thousands of years, right? This is just an old, one of the earliest kind of etchings where you see the fish ponds. So the name Ke'awalau o Pu'uloa, the many bays of Pu'uloa, Waimomi, pearl water, or Avava, I like this name, the lay of valleys of bays, right? It forms a lay if you look at it, so it does this sort of thing. So all poetic ways of designating this resource that was really, it's such a unique geography. I don't think there's any place else like it in the islands because it's a sunken river valley, right? These channels were carved when the water was much lower, and so it carved these channels. And this river is coming from two mountain ranges, the Waianae and the Ko'olau ranges, right? 12 or 13 stream beds or watersheds drain into it. They carve these valleys. Each one an ahupua'a that has its own name. Most of those names start with Y, right? Waimalu, Waimano, Waipi'o, all water. Y means water, right? So this place was rich, in other words. Because of that mixing, it made this one of the most fertile resources. It was also a place that embodied female power. So the Mo'iwahine, the supreme ruler of Oahu, Kala'i Manuia, she was one of the line of chiefly women that ruled Oahu. She was the one who began these public works to build fish ponds. So one of the first was built right near, just when you pass the stadium, going past into Aiea, on the left-hand side, I think the Navy calls it Magru Point.
Yes.
There's a fish pond in there, and the walls are still there. That was the first one that she built. There were like 36 in this complex altogether, but most of them are destroyed. I think there's only like 2 that are still intact. The other, the kind of the deities that are known from this area, Ka'ahu Pahau is the famous shark goddess or queen of this area. So she was a ruler who protected the people, right? She was known as a benevolent shark who would keep out man-eaters, right? And Kane Ko'ana is a mo'o wahine. She's like the kind of a water deity, a lizard or dragon-like a deity who brought the resources. So often the mo'o are protectors of freshwater sources and of like marine life. So the shellfish, the fish that came and it was abundant in here, she was credited with bringing it. And then when people were not pono, when they were not taking care of it, she took it all away. Right? If you look at the physical geography of the place, you can see, like I was saying, how all these ahupua'a, these different land divisions, have streams that empty into the bay, and all these light blue areas were wetlands. The dark blue ones are the fish ponds that used to be there. Okay? So the soccer field in Waipio, underneath this, okay, all here is still there. And even out here where the airport is now, right, there are huge fish ponds. So, they were really productive, right? If you know about the engineering of Hawaiian fish ponds, it's a very efficient system compared to modern aquaculture, right? You didn't have to raise or catch other fish and grind it up to feed your fish. This relied on the kind of solar energy coming into the brackish water where algae would grow. It attracts the herbivore fish. It comes in, eats, gets fat, can't swim up. Right? So they just sort of naturally recruit by creating a very productive habitat. And it helped to improve the water by straining out sediment and nutrients, right, to get trapped in the fish pond. So it was a really ingenious system. And just another map that shows some of these areas. An old map showing some of the fish ponds. This is Manana Peninsula. And they indicate here some of the oyster beds. These areas are all filled in. I talked about Kaneko on one of the famous resources of this area is the I'aham, or the pipi, Hawaiian pearl oyster. Another poetic name was the I'ahamaleo, the fish that silences the voice. The story was that these oysters would open up when the water was calm, right? So if you were harvesting oysters, you'd have to be really quiet. If you spoke and you ruffled the surface of the water, they would close, and you wouldn't be able to see them, right? But it also, I think there's also a play on this, the kauna, right? The hidden meaning of it, also might have to do with politics and how you keep certain knowledge hidden because it might be dangerous or seen as conspiratorial, right? So you'd have like the Eva church where they call their congregation the I'ahamaleo, right? You know, and they were a church that was very pro Hawaiian Kingdom. Like in the time of the overthrow, they were very upset about that. So we don't know exactly what that means, but I think that there are all these political kind of layers to how these names are used. So one of the things that like happens with pu'uloa especially is it gets wrapped up in the political economy around sugar, right? So after the Civil War, Hawaiian sugar is growing because it was supplying the United States, the North, with sugar after the South was cut off, right? Now the war ends, Hawaii wants to get an advantageous position with to sell their sugar, and so they want to establish a free trade agreement. We call it the Treaty of Reciprocity, that would lower the tariff on Hawaiian sugar, right, and allow them, the sugar growers, to make a profit. And so this is happening at the same time that Schofield and Alexander are touring the islands. Let's see. I didn't include that. There was an editorial by the Honolulu Advertiser publisher, Whitney, who's suggesting that the kingdom should cede pu'uloa to the United States as a way to sweeten the deal, right? And that upset Hawaiians, right? There's like mass meetings, there's all these protests, angry letters. So Kalakaua took that clause out, right? He said, no, that's not going to work. So they were able to get the first Treaty of Reciprocity passed. Hawaiian sugar growers made a lot of money. When it came time for the treaty to be renewed, now there's a lot more opposition from American sugar growers, right? Who feel like it's an unfair advantage. And so what happens, in order to make sure that the treaty is renewed in 1887, this group of businessmen staged the first act in the coup d'etat, in the takeover, right? They forced the king to sign a new constitution. We call it the Bayonet Constitution because it was done under threat of violence, which disenfranchised the majority of Native Hawaiians. If you didn't own land or property, you didn't meet property requirements, you couldn't vote. White foreigners could vote and could hold office. And if you're an Asian immigrant working in the plantation, so at this time, this is when Japanese were a growing, population in the sugar industry, you were excluded from citizenship by this new constitution. You couldn't become a citizen, you couldn't have rights. And so it really radically changed the whole thing. But the most significant shift that it enabled was the ratification of this Treaty of Reciprocity, the second Treaty of Reciprocity, which gave the United States exclusive use of pu'uloa, Pearl Harbor. And so this is, Professor John Osorio talks about this as kind of like the dismemberment of the Hawaiian Kingdom, right? It's the beginning of its being taken apart piece by piece. So when Queen Liliuokalani takes the throne, she is trying to reverse that, right? She's being petitioned by Hawaiian people to reverse that really bad Bayonet Constitution. And this is when the second part of the overthrow takes place, the second act in this takeover. Committee of Safety, conspiring with U.S. minister, land American troops that provide the muscle for this small group to take over, right? But it's an act of war, according to President Cleveland, against a friendly nation that the U.S. has, treaties with. It's a violation of sovereignty, but he is unable or unwilling to reverse the actions of the minister, right? So the Committee of Safety becomes a Republic of Hawaii, and they keep trying to annex Hawaii to the United States in order to maximize their sugar profit. The point I want to make is that these guns that came in 1893, they've just sort of morphed into all the military apparatus that we now have in the islands, right? So there's a kind of a contradiction that goes back to this breach. This was a broken relationship that took place when U.S. troops landed with their guns against a neutral sovereign country, right? And it's multiplied into what we have. So this is why there's a, you know, if we're going to understand anything about like Hawaii's history and some of the political problems we have now, you got to understand that there's this broken relationship that goes back to these acts over 100 years ago. You probably all have covered all this stuff, right? No? Yes, haven't. Oh, okay. Okay, so the group that seizes power, they try to annex Hawaii to the United States twice, but both times the Treaty of Annexation fails, right? The second time in 1897, Hawaiians are so organized, they do these petition drives that capture like something like 90% of the Hawaiian public opposed to annexation to the United States. That's a really amazing figure, right? That many people they want their country to be independent. But despite that, and despite the fact that this succeeds in defeating the Treaty of Annexation, so without a treaty, you can't transact sovereign territory, right? I can't write myself a note that says I take your car or I take your house without you signing it off and saying, okay, I agree, right? It's the same principle with the sovereignty and territory of a country between states. So without a treaty that transacts that, there is no actual shift in sovereignty. But what we have is, you know, basically a shotgun wedding, right? The U.S. engages in the Spanish-American War in 1898, and so through military necessity, they pass a simple law that says, okay, well, we have to take Hawaii, otherwise we can't hold the Philippines, right? And now the U.S., you know, can extend its wings from Manila all the way to Puerto Rico, right? So it's just kind of like, this is, again, Mahan's vision. 2 oceans connected through Panama. And if you look at today, the logo for the United States Pacific Command, it's almost the same eagle. It's spreading its wings, right? So, you know, I think that that's part of the contradiction that we still have to address, that is with the military presence here. And if you look at, this is a map of the Pacific Command today. It covers an area from the west coast of North America to the Central Indian Ocean, Alaska, all the way to Antarctica. It includes Antarctica. So majority of the surface of the planet and most of the people on the planet fall within this area of responsibility that's headquartered